The first thing she noticed was the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that one might find in a peaceful meadow or a quiet room. No, this silence was thick and heavy, as though the very air around her was pressing in, muffling any sound that dared to exist. She stood at the edge of the forest, her feet rooted to the spot as if she were afraid to move. Her heart pounded in her chest, the only sound she could hear, a persistent thudding that seemed to echo in her head. She didn't know how she had gotten here, or even where here was. The last thing she remembered was nothing. There was no last thing. Her mind was a blank slate, devoid of memories or a sense of self. She looked down at her hands, noting the dirt under her fingernails, the small cuts on her knuckles. Her clothes were simple, blue jeans and a dark red plaid shirt, both of which were worn and slightly torn, as if she had been wandering for some time. But how long? How long had she been here? She took a step forward, her feet crunching on the dry leaves that covered the ground. The forest loomed before her, dark and forbidding, the trees standing like sentinels guarding secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. She glanced behind her, but there was nothing there, just more trees, stretching out as far as she could see. There was no path, no sign of where she had come from, no indication of where she should go. With no other options, she moved forward, her steps slow and hesitant. As she walked, the trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisting and intertwining above her head, blocking out the sky. The light grew dimmer, the shadows deeper, until it felt as though she were walking through a tunnel of darkness. She tried to remember something, anything, about who she was, but her mind remained frustratingly blank. There were no memories of family or friends, no sense of what she had been doing before she found herself in this strange place. All she had were questions that circled in her mind like vultures, waiting to pick apart the pieces of her fragmented thoughts. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, making her flinch and glance around, half expecting to see something, or someone, emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of trees, and the feeling that she was being watched. She tried to push the thought away, but it clung to her, gnawing at the edges of her consciousness. The feeling wasn't just a vague sense of unease, it was something more tangible, a presence that seemed to lurk just beyond the periphery of her vision. She stopped walking and turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But the forest was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding small and fragile in the vastness of the woods. There was no answer, only the echo of her own voice fading into the distance. She clenched her fists, feeling a surge of frustration and fear. She didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to find her way out of this place. As she stood there, trying to decide which direction to take, she noticed something in the distance. A faint light, barely visible through the thick trees. It was small and flickering, as though someone had lit a candle or a small fire. Hope flared within her, and she began to move toward the light, her pace quickening with each step. The light grew brighter as she approached, and soon she could make out the shape of a small cabin nestled among the trees. The cabin was old and weathered, its wooden walls covered in moss and vines. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the warm glow of a fire flickered through the windows. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, suddenly unsure of herself. Who lived in the cabin? Would they help her, or would they turn her away? But she had no other options, no other place to go. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the cabin. As she approached the door, she noticed that the light inside flickered strangely, as if the fire was barely holding on. The thought made her uneasy, but she pushed it aside and knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the stillness, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but still, there was no response. She tried the door handle, and to her surprise, it turned easily in her hand. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The cabin was small, with a single room that served as both kitchen and living area. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. There was a table with 2 chairs, a few shelves with pots and pans, and a narrow bed in the corner. But the cabin was empty. There was no sign of the person who had lit the fire, no indication that anyone had been there recently. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. She wrinkled her nose, trying to place the smell, but it eluded her. She walked over to the fire, holding out her hands to warm them. As she did, she noticed something odd. There was a small object on the hearth, half hidden in the shadows. She bent down to pick it up, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a locket, old and tarnished, with a faded photograph inside. The image was of a woman, her face blurry and indistinct, but there was something familiar about her. The woman was wearing a dark red plaid shirt, just like the one she had on. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the photograph, a sense of unease creeping over her. Who was the woman in the picture? Was it her? And if it was, why didn't she remember? She turned the locket over in her hands, and as she did, she noticed something scratched into the back. It was hard to make out, but after a moment, she realized it was a name. Angela. The name sent a jolt of recognition through her, but it was fleeting, like a word on the tip of her tongue that she couldn't quite grasp. Was that her name? Was she Angela? Before she could think any further, a sound from outside made her freeze. It was a low, rumbling growl, so deep that she felt it in her bones. She turned toward the door, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The growl came again, louder this time, and she backed away from the door, her eyes wide with fear. The fire flickered, and for a moment, the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift, as though something was moving just out of sight. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and she realized with a jolt of terror that it was coming closer. Whatever was out there, it was coming for her. She stumbled back toward the bed, her hands shaking as she gripped the locket. The growling was so close now that she could feel it vibrating through the floorboards. She didn't know what to do, where to hide, how to escape. The door burst open with a crash, and she screamed, dropping the locket as she scrambled to the far corner of the room. But there was nothing there, no monstrous creature, no animal with glowing eyes and sharp teeth. The doorway was empty, the night beyond it dark and still. She stood there, trembling, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The growling had stopped, but the fear lingered, gnawing at her like a festering wound. She was alone in the cabin, the silence pressing down on her once again. But then she heard something else. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering her name. Angela. She turned toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. It was coming from the hearth, where the locket lay on the floor, glinting in the firelight. Angela. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made her skin crawl. She stared at the locket, her mind racing. She had to get out of there. She couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. She turned and ran toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The night air was cold against her skin as she burst out into the clearing, the forest looming around her like a dark, impenetrable wall. But as she ran, something strange began to happen. The trees seemed to shift and change, the branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, the shadows twisting and writhing as if alive. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, as though it were shifting and buckling under her weight. She didn't stop running, didn't look back. The forest was closing in around her, the darkness swallowing her whole. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out. But no matter how far she ran, the trees never thinned, the darkness never lifted. The forest stretched on endlessly, a labyrinth of shadows and secrets that she couldn't escape. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the undergrowth, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving, had to keep running. But the voice followed her, whispering her name in the darkness. Angela. Angela. She tried to block it out, tried to focus on finding a way out of the forest. But the voice was relentless, insistent, growing louder with each passing moment. Angela. Come back. She stumbled to a halt, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The voice was so close now, so loud that it seemed to echo inside her head. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. The forest was silent, the trees standing like dark sentinels in the night. But there was something else, something just out of sight, something that she couldn't see but could feel. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. The shadows seemed to shift and move, as if something were emerging from the darkness. Angela. The voice was right behind her now, so close that she could feel the breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, her eyes wide with fear. But there was nothing there. Only the forest, dark and silent, stretching out into infinity. She stood there, trembling, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The voice had stopped, but the fear remained, a cold, gnawing dread that she couldn't shake. She was lost, alone in the darkness, with no memory of who she was or how she had come to be there. The forest was a maze, a labyrinth of shadows and secrets that she couldn't escape. And somewhere in the darkness, something was waiting for her, something that she couldn't see but could feel, lurking just out of sight, watching her every move. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let the fear consume her. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out of the forest. But as she turned to walk away, the voice whispered once more, so soft that she barely heard it. Angela. Welcome home. And in that moment, she realized the truth. She wasn't lost in the forest. She was exactly where she was meant to be,